Hi everyone, and welcome to Shukin Science. In this video, we'll talk about the path of blood flow through the circulatory system, starting with the big picture. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we should remind ourselves the purpose of these structures. The entire reason we have a heart and blood and lungs is to make sure that oxygen can get to every cell in our body. Our cells need oxygen so that they can perform cell respiration and create ATP. And all of these structures that you see here work together to make sure that that can happen. So when the structures in our body, including our brain, use up the oxygen, they then release carbon dioxide back into the bloodstream because CO2 is a byproduct of cell respiration. So when that oxygenated blood, which we see here in red, gets used by these different structures, a process known as gas exchange happens in each of these locations, where the oxygen is taken up by cells, and then the cells use that oxygen and release carbon dioxide back into the bloodstream as a byproduct. Now the goal from there is to get that deoxygenated blood back to the heart and then pump it back out to the lungs to get reoxygenated. So from these structures, our deoxygenated blood will return to the heart through a few different key blood vessels. And then the heart is going to apply pressure and squeeze that deoxygenated blood out to the lungs. It's in the lungs where gas exchange happens a second time. But in this case, the opposite is happening. So the deoxygenated blood that arrives to the lungs, that CO2 is going to get exhaled, and then through the process of inhalation, oxygen is now going to enter the bloodstream. And then as the heart relaxes, that newly oxygenated blood from the lungs is going to return to the heart, and then the heart will contract once again to push that newly oxygenated blood out to the body and the brain once again. And then the cycle repeats. So what we have here are two loops or two pathways that blood flows through. The first pathway, where it goes from the heart out to the body and brain and then back to the heart again, that pathway is known as the systemic pathway or systemic loop. Whereas the path where blood comes back to the heart, gets pumped to the lungs, and then back to the heart again to get pumped back out, that is known as the pulmonary pathway or pulmonary loop. And there are a couple of key differences between these two pathways that we should be aware of. Since the systemic blood vessels need to move blood a lot further, it tends to have a higher blood pressure compared to the blood vessels of the pulmonary pathway. Since those blood vessels aren't actually moving blood that far, I mean, think of the distance from your heart to your lungs, then they tend to have a lower blood pressure in comparison to the systemic pathway. And that is also helpful because when the blood arrives to the lungs, it's going to move through teeny tiny blood vessels and enter small sacs of air called alveoli. If the blood pressure was too high, it might even cause those alveoli to burst. So the low blood pressure in this pulmonary loop is actually an advantage in some ways compared to the high blood pressure in this systemic loop. So that's the big picture. We have heart to lungs and back to heart for the pulmonary loop, and then heart to brain and body, back to the heart for the systemic loop. Now let's zoom into this primary organ, the heart, to see what's going on here. So as you can see, the heart actually consists of 4 separate chambers. And the labeling can get a little bit confusing at times because technically we can divide the heart into a left side and a right side, divided by this wall of tissue here, known as the septum. However, I wouldn't label this as left and this as right as though I'm looking at it. I would actually label the left and the right side as though this was in my own body. So actually, this is the left side of the heart and this is the right side. So this top chamber is going to be labeled as the left atrium, whereas the top chamber on this side, that is actually the right atrium. So the top chambers are both atria, and as you can see, they're a little bit smaller compared to the chambers down below. These two chambers are both known as ventricles, so that would make this the left ventricle, and this would be the right ventricle then. And so the layer of tissue that surround these chambers is thick muscle. The heart is really just one big pump, and so it makes sense that the muscle that surrounds each of these chambers would have to be so tough. It is literally contracting your entire life, and so that muscle, it needs to be strong. So starting up here with the right atrium, when blood has been used up by the body and the brain, and it has now become deoxygenated, the first place that the blood returns from the systemic loop is through this right atrium. So the blood is going to move through some blood vessels into this right atrium. And the blood vessel that takes in blood from the top half of your body, mainly the brain, that one is known as the superior vena cava. Whereas the blood vessel that brings it from the lower half of your body, that one is known as the inferior vena cava. Superior just meaning top and inferior meaning bottom. So this is the first path that blood takes, and that would be from the brain and the body back to the heart. Now, once blood enters this little right atrium here, the heart is going to have its first contraction, and actually both atria are going to contract at the same time. When those atria contract, it's going to push blood down into the ventricles below, and as it's moving down into this right ventricle, it's going to pass by a set of valves known as the atrioventricular or AV valves. And the purpose of those valves is really just to act as a one-way door. So as this contracts and blood moves through, then they're actually going to snap shut when the ventricle eventually contracts so that blood can't move backwards. So valves play a really important role in separating these chambers and just ensuring that blood can move only in one direction. So when that right atrium contracts, it's going to push the blood down into the right ventricle. The AV valve is going to start to snap shut as pressure builds in this right ventricle, because eventually this ventricle will now contract and it's going to push blood into an area of low pressure. So rather than pushing it back into the right atrium, which is now closed due to that valve, a second valve, known as a semilunar valve, is going to open up. And as this semilunar valve opens up, now the blood from the right ventricle is going to get pushed out of the heart through this blood vessel here. It branches, so half of it goes this way, and then half of it is going to move in this direction. And those blood vessels are known as the pulmonary arteries. And you have two of them, so you have a left pulmonary artery and a right pulmonary artery because you have two lungs, and that's where the blood is going next. So when the deoxygenated blood leaves the heart through the pulmonary arteries, it's getting pumped now through the the pulmonary pathway, a very short distance to the lungs. And same with over here. In the lungs, gas exchange is going to happen, and now we have oxygenated blood that is going to return to the heart from the lungs. Oops, sorry about that. So once that blood has now gotten rid of the CO2 and picked up some oxygen, it is going to get pulled back into the heart through these blood vessels here, known as the pulmonary veins. And of course, you have another set of pulmonary veins on this side, returning blood from the lungs. And that newly oxygenated blood, these blood vessels kind of tuck in back and deliver it through this way. The newly oxygenated blood is going to re-enter the heart first into this left atrium. So into this chamber, we're going to have blood starting to pool, and then the atria are going to contract and push that newly oxygenated blood down into the left ventricle through another set of atrioventricular valves. Those valves will eventually snap shut as pressure builds in this left ventricle, and then eventually the left ventricle will contract and it will push that newly oxygenated blood out through another set of semilunar valves, and then it is going to move out through this massive blood vessel here known as the aorta. The aorta is one of the most well-known blood vessels in the body just simply due to its size. It has to carry a very large volume of blood. And of course, the aorta is going to move that newly oxygenated blood to the brain and body. There are lots of different branches of the aorta. So there's another trunk that's going to kind of come down this way. And then eventually, all of the cells in our body will receive oxygenated blood from different branches of the aorta. And then the cycle repeats. Then that deoxygenated blood gets sent back to the heart through these vena cava blood vessels and so on. Now, one thing that I'm hoping you noticed that distinguishes the two ventricles from one another, other than one carrying oxygenated and one carrying deoxygenated blood, is just the size of the muscle tissue that surrounds each. The right ventricle appears to be a little bit bigger than the left ventricle. And that's actually because the muscle tissue that surrounds this right side isn't quite as thick. You'll notice here the muscle tissue that surrounds the left ventricle is much thicker compared to that on the right side. And that makes sense because when the left ventricle contracts, it's pushing blood all the way to our brain and our fingers and our toes. So it needs to have a very powerful contraction in order to apply enough pressure to force that blood out. Whereas when the right ventricle contracts, it's really only pushing blood out to the lungs, which again isn't a very long distance. So that's why the blood pressure in this pulmonary circuit differs quite significantly compared to the systemic pathway. And that's the path of blood flow. If you want to learn a little bit more about the electrical impulses that cause the heart to beat, then check out my next video. Thanks, everyone.